Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at Atomic Habits by James Clear. I think a lot of our listeners are interested in this, how habits work and how to improve them.
Yeah.
So I think this will be really great. And what I found really interesting about James Clear's story is it's not like a typical, overnight success story.
Yeah.
He had a really serious baseball injury in high school. And his recovery was just this amazing journey of, tiny breakthroughs and small wins.
Yeah. It's really, it really illustrates this concept of compounding that's central to his whole philosophy. It's these seemingly insignificant daily choices and actions that accumulate over time. Kind of like interest compounding on money.
Yeah. And so what you do every day really matters more than what you do once in a while,
Right.
And he actually quantified this, showing that if you get 1% better every day, you end up almost 38 times better by the end of the year, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that consistency is key. And Clear also challenges that sort of typical goals-first mentality that a lot of us have. He argues that fixating solely on goals, it creates this either-or scenario where you either achieve the goal and you feel successful, or you don't and you feel like a failure.
Oh, that's interesting. So if focusing on goals isn't always the best approach, what's the alternative?
He advocates for this identity-based approach to habits. So instead of focusing on what you want to achieve, focus on who you want to become.
Right. So, that makes me think of, the old adage, fake it till you make it. But how does simply changing your mindset, actually lead to habit change?
Yeah, it's not just about changing your mindset. It's about aligning your actions with your desired identity. So studies have shown that people naturally act in accordance with their perceived identity. So for example, if you see yourself as a healthy person, you're more likely to make healthy choices without having to force yourself.
Well, that's interesting. So it's about embodying the identity that aligns with the habits that you want to cultivate.
Right.
So, okay, that makes sense. But how do habits actually form in the first place?
Yeah, so Clear breaks down habit formation into 4 stages: cue, craving, response, and reward. And you can think of this as a neurological feedback loop.
Okay.
So the cue triggers your brain to initiate a behavior. Then you have a craving for the anticipated reward. The response is the actual action you take. And finally, the reward sort of reinforces the habit, making you want to repeat it.
Okay, so let's say my cue is walking into the kitchen after work, and I see a bowl of candy on the counter.
Right.
And the craving is for that sugary taste. The response is grabbing a handful, and the reward is the instant pleasure.
Exactly, yeah. And for a behavior to become a habit, it needs to be successful in all 4 stages. So if any part of that loop is weak, if the cue is too subtle or the reward isn't satisfying enough, the habit is less likely to stick.
Okay, so that's where the habit scorecard comes in, right?
Right.
That exercise where you list all your daily habits and categorize them.
Precisely. Yeah, it's about bringing conscious awareness to those often unconscious routines. And you might be surprised by how much you do on autopilot without even realizing it.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I've been trying to be more mindful of my phone usage, and it's amazing how often I just find myself scrolling without even thinking about it.
Yeah. And that brings us to another crucial element, which is environment design. Clear really emphasizes that our surroundings have a powerful influence on our behavior.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
If I surround myself with healthy snacks and hide the junk food, I'm much more likely to make a healthy choice.
Exactly. Yeah, and Clear often cites this study at Massachusetts General Hospital where they found that simply rearranging the placement of food in the cafeteria significantly impacted what people chose to eat. So making healthy options more visible and convenient actually led to people choosing them more often.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's a great example of how subtle changes in our environment can kind of nudge us towards better choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what about those bad habits that are hard to resist? How do we make them less appealing?
Well, Clear explains that a lot of our cravings stem from our brain's reward system not having caught up to modern day temptations. Our brains are still wired to crave things like salt, sugar, and fat, things that were scarce for most of human history. But now we're bombarded with, hyper palatable processed foods that hijack those primal instincts.
Yeah, so it's we're constantly fighting against these hardwired desires.
Right.
It makes resisting temptation seem almost impossible.
It can be challenging, yeah. But Clear suggests kind of a reframing. So instead of solely focusing on making bad habits unsatisfying, which can feel like deprivation, what if we focus on making good habits more satisfying?
Okay, that's a good point. But a lot of good habits, like exercising or saving money, those have delayed rewards.
Right.
How do we make them, feel good right now?
Well, that's where understanding dopamine's role comes in. Dopamine is released not just from experiencing pleasure, but also from the anticipation of reward. So if we can find ways to add immediate rewards to those long-term habits, we can create like a positive feedback loop that keeps us motivated.
So we're essentially hacking our brain's reward system.
Right.
That's fascinating. Do you have any examples of how to actually do that?
Absolutely. Clear uses this example of the Polgar sisters. They were three Hungarian chess prodigies, and their parents created this environment where chess was constantly praised and rewarded. It became like their norm.
So instead of chess feeling like a chore, it became something that they, craved.
Right.
So how can we apply this to our own lives? How can we make those healthy habits more immediately rewarding?
Yeah, well, one simple but effective technique is the 2-minute rule.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's this rule all about?
It's surprisingly straightforward. When you're starting a new habit, scale it down to its easiest 2-minute version. So instead of committing to a 30-minute workout, just focus on putting on your workout clothes. Instead of writing a whole chapter, just write one sentence.
So it's about removing as much friction as possible.
Exactly.
And making it almost impossible not to get started.
Right. And once you've overcome that initial inertia, it's much easier to keep going. You've already, started building that momentum.
That's a great tip. I mean, it seems so simple, but I can see how powerful it could be. But how do we know which habits to focus on? There's so many things we could potentially improve.
Yeah, that's where this concept of finding a game where the odds are in your favor comes into play.
Okay, I like that metaphor.
Yeah.
So it's about playing to our strength and finding habits that align with our natural abilities and interests.
Precisely. Clear emphasizes that genes don't determine our destiny, but they do highlight areas of opportunity where we're more likely to find satisfaction and success.
It's about capitalizing on those areas where we have a natural inclination to excel. But how do we actually find those areas?
It starts with exploration. Try different things. Pay attention to what comes easily to you, what you genuinely enjoy doing.
So experimenting and paying attention to what feels naturally rewarding.
Right.
But even when we find those sweet spots, maintaining motivation over time can be a challenge.
Absolutely. And that's where the Goldilocks rule comes in.
Now I'm really intrigued. What's the Goldilocks rule all about?
It's the idea that we're most motivated when working on tasks that are just slightly beyond our current abilities. Not too easy, not too hard, but just right.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where we feel challenged but not overwhelmed.
Exactly. And this is crucial for maintaining long-term engagement with our habits. Once a habit becomes too easy, we get bored. If it's too difficult, we get discouraged. But if it's right on the edge of our comfort zone, we hit that flow state where we're fully engaged and motivated.
This is all starting to make a lot of sense. It's not just about grit or willpower. It's about understanding the subtle forces that shape our behavior and then leveraging those forces to our advantage.
Yeah.
But how do we break those bad habits that seem so ingrained?
That's a great question, and one we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore strategies for increasing friction, making bad habits unsatisfying, and harnessing the power of habit tracking and accountability.
I'm looking forward to it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into atomic habits. Last time we were talking about how to make good habits more rewarding and motivating, but let's face it, we all have those bad habits we're trying to break.
Oh, absolutely. It's like that bag of chips that magically appears in my pantry every time I'm stressed.
Yeah.
So how do we tackle those unwanted behaviors?
Yeah, well, Clear emphasizes that, willpower alone isn't always enough. He suggests increasing friction, like making those bad habits less convenient.
Okay, so making it harder to give in to temptation.
Right.
Can you give me a real world example of this?
Yeah, he points to the invention of the cash register. Back in the late 1800s, this saloon owner, John Patterson, he had a problem with employee theft because there was no way to track transactions. Then he comes across this, the first cash register, Ritty's incorruptible cashier.
Oh, so it made it impractical to steal because there was a record of every transaction.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's the same principle with our own bad habits. If you want to stop snacking on chips, don't even keep them in the house. Make it inconvenient to access them.
That's a good point. Out of sight, out of mind, right? And what about those bad habits we can't eliminate entirely, like checking email constantly?
Yeah, think about ways to make them less appealing. So turn off notifications. Or set specific times to check your email instead of letting it interrupt you all day long.
I could even use like an app blocker during certain hours to prevent myself from like mindlessly scrolling on social media.
Right, now you're getting it.
Yeah.
We can actually use technology to our advantage in that way. Automate those good habits and make those tempting bad habits more difficult.
Yeah, I love the idea of like outsourcing my willpower to technology. It's like having a personal assistant for my good habits.
Precisely. Think about, setting up automatic savings transfers or scheduling reminders to take breaks and stretch throughout the day.
Yeah, that frees up our mental energy for more important things like creativity and problem solving. But even when we make those good habits convenient, how do we bridge that gap between like the immediate temptation and the delayed reward?
Well, Clear suggests adding a little bit of immediate pleasure to those long-term habits. So think about bundling a habit you want to do with one you need to do.
So if I want to watch my favorite TV show, but I also need to exercise more, I could only allow myself to watch it while I'm on the treadmill.
Yeah, perfect example. It's about finding those creative ways to make those must-do habits more enjoyable.
Yeah. What about those habits that aren't inherently fun, like paying bills or doing chores? Those are the ones I struggle with the most. Any advice for making those less dreadful?
Yeah, well, Clear recommends rewarding yourself for completing those tasks. But the key is to choose rewards that align with your long-term goals.
So instead of rewarding myself with a pizza after a long day, I could treat myself to, like, a relaxing bath or a good book.
Now you're thinking strategically, yeah. It's about aligning your rewards with the person you want to become.
That makes sense. It's all about, like, reinforcing that desired identity.
Speaking of reinforcement, what about the role of habit tracking? I've always been curious about that.
Yeah, habit tracking is a powerful tool. It makes our progress visible, which can be incredibly motivating.
It's like a visual reminder of how far we've come. And I bet it's pretty satisfying to, check those boxes off on a habit tracker,
Absolutely, yeah. It taps into our brain's reward system, but it also helps us identify patterns in our behavior. So, like, what triggers our good habits and what sabotages our progress.
It's like becoming our own scientist, experimenting with different approaches to see what works best for us. Exactly. And if you want to take accountability to another level, consider finding an accountability partner. Knowing that someone's watching can be incredibly motivating.
Yeah, I've always found it easier to stick to my goals when I have someone to share the journey with. It's like having a built-in cheerleader.
Right, yeah. It's about creating that positive, supportive environment. And this ties into a crucial point that Claire makes. Our habits ultimately shape our identity.
Oh, that reminds me of something we were talking about earlier, how our actions reinforce, like who we believe we are. But how do we, break free from those limiting beliefs that might be holding us back? I know I have a few of those lurking in the shadows.
Well, Clear suggests shifting our focus from proving ourselves right to proving ourselves wrong.
I'm intrigued. What do you mean by that?
Instead of clinging to those old stories like, I'm not good at math or I'm always late, challenge those beliefs. Seek out experiences that contradict them.
So it's about, collecting evidence that disproves those limiting narratives.
Yeah. Exactly. As you start racking up those small wins, as you see yourself acting in ways that align with your desired identity, those old beliefs start to crumble.
This reminds me of the concept of neuroplasticity, the idea that our brains can actually change and adapt based on our experiences. So it's like we're rewiring our brains to support those positive habits and beliefs.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where the real power of Atomic Habits lies. Not just in changing our behaviors, but in transforming our sense of self.
This has been an incredibly insightful discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, from understanding how habits form to exploring strategies for making them work for us. What final thoughts can you leave our listeners with as we wrap up our deep dive?
It has been, hasn't it? A lot of what we've talked about has been these really practical tips, but I think the deeper thing in Atomic Habits, and I hope this is what listeners get from it, is how these habits shape who we become.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's not just about checking off boxes. It's about becoming that type of person who lives those habits. But to achieve that kind of transformation, doesn't that require some level of talent or ability?
Well, Clear uses these examples of Michael Phelps and Hicham El Guerrouj, both record-breaking athletes. And, it sort of illustrates how genes can play a role. Phelps, the swimmer, his body's really built for the water, and El Guerrouj has these incredibly efficient strides. But he emphasizes that genes are not destiny.
Right. So while our genes might kind of give us a little nudge in certain directions, they don't dictate like our limits.
Exactly. Yeah. The key is to find what Clear calls a game where the odds are in your favor. And so that means identifying those pursuits that align with your natural abilities and interests. It's about finding your strengths and then really doubling down on them.
That makes me think of like Bloom where you're planted. But how do we actually find those areas where we have like that natural advantage?
It requires exploration. Step outside your comfort zone, experiment with different activities, and really pay attention to what comes easily to you, what you genuinely enjoy. And when you find something that feels effortless, that's a good sign you're on the right track.
It's about following that spark of excitement, that flow where you lose track of time because you're so engrossed in what you're doing.
Precisely, yeah. And once you find those sweet spots, it's about really honing your skills. And Clear highlights the importance of this, what he calls the Goldilocks rule.
Okay, you mentioned that before. Remind me, what's the Goldilocks rule all about?
Yeah, it's the idea that we're most motivated when we're working on tasks that are just slightly beyond our current abilities. Not too easy, not too hard, just right.
Yeah, I think that's something we can all relate to. We've all experienced that feeling of being in the zone when we're working on something that stretches us just enough.
Exactly. And to achieve mastery in any field, we need to constantly challenge ourselves. Find those little ways to level up our skills.
It's like a video game, right? You need to keep leveling up to stay engaged and avoid getting bored.
That's a great analogy. And it applies to anything we want to excel at, whether it's writing or playing music or cooking or building a business. It's about finding that sweet spot where we're constantly learning and growing.
So to sum it up, Atomic Habits isn't just a self-help book about checking things off a list. It's like a guide to becoming like the architect of your own life, one small habit at a time.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It reminds us that we have the power to shape our destiny, not through like these grand gestures, but through these tiny, consistent actions. And that ultimately defines who we are.
Yeah, this deep dive has given us so much to think about. I hope our listeners take these insights and start building those atomic habits that lead them to a more fulfilling life.
I agree, yeah. And if I could leave the listener with one thought, it'd be this. What's that small habit you can start today that aligns with that desired identity? It doesn't have to be a huge change. Even something that takes like 2 minutes can set you on that path to becoming the person you want to be.
That's a great question for our listeners to ponder. And that wraps up our deep dive into atomic habits. Thanks for joining us and happy habit building.